Hi, everyone. I'm Father Jim Martin. I'm editor of Outreach, and this is another in our series of conversations called Outspoken. I'm joined by Ryan Di Corpo, who is managing editor of Outreach, and we are very happy to have a special guest, Austen Ivereigh, who probably needs no introduction. But I can say that the quickest way to introduce Austen, in addition to being a superb journalist and theologian, is that he is the Pope's biographer. And he's done a wonderful job in introducing Pope Francis in so many different ways and in so many different venues to the general public. I think his biographies are truly the best way to kind of come to understand Pope Francis, with whom he has worked very closely over the years. Austen participated in the Synod, Synod of Bishops in October, where I was also a member. And we're going to speak with him today a little bit about the Synod and LGBTQ people. So Austen, first of all, thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you, Jim, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
Now, Austen, we know the LGBTQ issues were certainly not the only thing that we discussed at the Synod. But can you give our viewers a little bit of an overview of how these issues came to be discussed, how they sort of worked their way into the Instrumentum Laboris, just the kind of a little bit of a history of that topic in the Synod?
Sure. And before I answer that question, just to point out that I was at the assembly as you were, but we were there in different capacities. So you were, of course, seated at a table as a member. You had full right to speak and to vote. So you were directly a member. I was a participant rather than a member. I mean, I was described as an expert theologian. So our job was to read what was coming out of the groups and then to help compile the synthesis report. So I'm saying that because, you know, I when I speak about the assembly, I'm doing so, as it were, with that slightly kind of standing back and seeing the whole rather than being involved at the tables. I've also been involved in the Synod from the beginning, actually, because here in England and Wales, you can tell from my voice I'm English, I was asked to be one of the drafters of the national England and Wales synthesis of all the diocesan reports. That was back in early 22. And then later in 2022, I was part of the group in Frascati we had to read all of the National Bishops' Conference reports. There are 118 of them, and do this kind of global synthesis, which we then called the document for the continental stage, which then formed the basis of the 7 continental assemblies earlier this year. And I wasn't involved in any of the assemblies, but then I was invited back for this assembly. So in a way, I've kind of followed the development of the Synod right from the beginning and had these different perspectives on it. And I would say, in answer to your question, that the question of the inclusion, and that's really usually how it's been expressed, of LGBT people has been there from the beginning, certainly very strongly in Europe and America, where it emerges as a central, I would say, central issue. And then, of course, when we were coming to look at the question globally, of course, you discover that it's completely then absent from many of the national reports from the developing world, or it's framed in very different terms. So I would say it's been there from the beginning. The question of inclusion, I remember in the England and Wales drafting team, where we were reading these diocesan reports which said that gay people need to be better included in the life of the church, you know, or by the church. And we kept having to ask ourselves, well, what do people mean by that? You know, what does inclusion mean? Because, you know, we all know that going to mass on Sundays, you know, there are plenty of LGBT people in the pews. And in fact, we know there are plenty of LGBT people, you know, present in the priesthood, present in religious life. In fact, one would say the churches are kind of get naturally attractive in many ways to gay people. So what is meant by that? And then, of course, you get into discussions about, well, is this about teaching? Is this about kind of homophobia? And I would say from the beginning that has not been clear. And I think in the reports there's an ambiguity from the very beginning, and that's how I would describe it: strongly present. Desire for inclusion, but a kind of lack of clarity about what people generally mean by that.
What would you say the breakdown would be? I mean, I noticed in the hall, without kind of breaking confidence, that there were 2 approaches. One approach would be, you know, in favor of inclusion, but also bringing in stories of individual LGBTQ Catholics, you know, seeing them as people. Cardinal Stephen Chow actually just this morning talked about seeing them not as categories or teachings, but as people, as individuals. And then I would say the other side might have been kind of responding to LGBTQ issues as an ideology or as neocolonialism. Austen, were you able to get a sense of sort of how big those two sort of sides were? Like, where do you think most people would see themselves in the synod? I mean, how would you kind of break it down in terms of the members and the
I,
participants?
I'm not sure that that's we're able to do that, because I think actually there were not actually that many interventions on the
Mm,
topic. You and I talked about it during the assembly. In fact, the conversation, such as it was, never got off the ground. I mean, to me, this is one of the great takeaways from that assembly, is that in order to have, I mean, some people, just to be clear about expectations, I mean, some people were saying before the synod, well, same-sex blessings. I mean, that would be, if you like, the great issue about which, certainly in the church in Europe and the church in the US, there has been tremendous discussion. As you know, for example, the German bishops and I think the Dutch and the Belgians would take the view in Europe that the church is able to give, at least at an individual basis, blessings for same-sex couples. There's an argument about whether these are institutional or not. So one might expect, but then of course the Polish and the Hungarians completely against that. So you would expect that kind of debate to happen, but it never did. And I think it never did because in fact we were, as you know very well, discussing, I mean, people reacted very strongly even to the term LGBT, which they said is expressing anthropological categories which are not Christian. This is an ideological imposition from international agencies. So you had that kind of sense of just pushback against what was seen as an ideological imposition. So I'm not sure it ever. And then of course there were the voices, and I'm giving away no secrets by saying yours was one of them, obviously, which was focusing on individual stories and inviting people to see where the Spirit might be at work in their relationships, but also stories, heart-rending stories of discrimination and exclusion and straightforward prejudice, which I think resonated very strongly in the hall. But I would say that we never got to the stage of being able to have, I'm not sure it was a topic, I'm not sure actually it was really engaged with as a topic, not, for example, like the topic of women or women deacons, which was clearly discussed and emerged in the final synthesis document, has a whole section to itself. And the LGBT question just got nowhere near that. So, which in itself, of course, is where we are as a church. And as I said to you, we had a couple of conversations about this during the assembly. Yeah, what I found remarkable was that this conversation was happening at all. This is the first time, at a global level, such a diverse synod has happened. First of all, the fact that we had non-bishops there, women and religions was extraordinary. So, the conversation in itself, it was remarkable that it happened, that it never got going on certain topics or simply identified differences is to me not a surprise. What's remarkable to me is that we had the conversation and that we've committed ourselves to continuing that listening and that conversation.
Yeah, and before I turn it over to Ryan, I would say I might describe it a little differently. I would say that there was a conversation, but that there wasn't a whole lot of convergence around it. There are other issues that there was convergence, but my experience was that at the tables, particularly when topics of love and truth and teaching came up, it was talked about a lot. So there was a conversation, and there were, as you were saying, significant interventions. But you're right. I think that there were no real convergences on it. And as you say, even using the term LGBTQ was seen as controversial. I felt the same way towards the end, and my conversations with you helped me a lot to realize that this is the first time in a kind of universal meeting it's being discussed. I described it to someone the other day on a Zoom call as it's like someone coming out to their family for the first time.
Right.
There's a lot of emotion and a lot of kind of storm and drang, and then things have to settle down a little bit. Ryan, do you want to jump in?
Sure, Austin, there's obviously been a tremendous amount of attention focused on the lack of explicit or direct reference to LGBT people in the final synthesis report. And I should note that the final synthesis report, I'm referring to the report for this October, not the one for next, because we don't know what that one will say. But you had mentioned that there was a panel of theologians, including yourself, that put together the synthesis report from the documents from, I believe, 35 tables. So you had to go through 35 separate summaries that each table had provided and make some kind of report out of that. How was that process completed in a very short period of time. I believe it was only a few days. And was the term LGBTQ included in any of those documents that didn't then make the final one?
Sure. Yeah. And also just to explain, so yeah, with 35 small group reports, but also, of course, not just one report from each group, because we worked through 4 modules. So at the end of each module, there was a report from each small group. And so each module took, I think I'm right, Jim is saying 3 or 4 days. And then, of course, the group, having done its report, reported to the assembly, then revised its report in the light of what it heard and so on. So it's quite an elaborate process, and then it had to be voted on. So the reports that we got were the ones that were voted on. We also, of course, had to wade through a huge number of individual written submissions, because members were allowed also to put written. Now, you're asking me how many. I would say, look, I would divide it like this. I would say the Westerners, were quite happy on the whole to use the term LGBT, frankly, without thinking about it very much, because they say that's what, LGBT people want to be called. Then, of course, that's what we call them, we don't get into the kind of, what are those initials expressing, and then I think there was another group of people who expressed very strongly that they can't even use that term. So that was where the argument of I was quite struck among the theologians, and I'm talking here about kind of, Latin Americans and the Italians, so not belonging to what we might call the kind of the more gay phobic parts of the world, that we can think of, like kind of Africa and certain parts of Eastern Europe. And they were saying, they don't actually like the term LGBT, because they kind of agreed that the anthropology behind it was kind of questionable, or it needed to be interrogated. So I think there was a middle ground, if you like, where there was discomfort about the term. So anyway, the term didn't make it. I mean, but it did appear in the reports, absolutely. It didn't in many others. We know that there was a squabble over the use of it in many groups, because of course groups had people from all over the world together. Well, Jim can, no doubt talk about that. But yeah, so and then I wasn't part of the writing group, and I know that there was, of course, we did a draft, and then the whole assembly did what was called Modi, or amendments, and there were over I think it was 1,200 amendments were voted on, which then had to be incorporated very quickly into this doc. I mean, it was a kind of crazy process, because it was all done in, literally people were up all night, incorporating them. I mean, it was a fairly crazy process. But yeah, in the course of those amendments, incorporating the amendments, the term dropped out.
Was the process too quick? Was there, because you're describing wading through a tremendous amount of material in a very short period of time. Why was there only so much time allotted for that?
There's 2 things that people have said about the Synod from the very beginning. First of all, there's not enough time. There's never been enough time for anything. And the second thing people say is that it all goes on for too long. And actually both things are true. We were together, we were exhausted by the end of it, as Jim has written about. Over 3 weeks, if you include the retreat, nearly a month, just listening to people, it's very, very grueling and very hard. But on the other hand, given what we were dealing with, it was a very short time. And the process of the writing of that final and the approval of that final document went on for, it was some days, but it was a very complex process. Look, I think, the document wins no literary prizes, but I think it's a pretty good document in capturing what happened. And it, as you know, got voted on with an overwhelming consensus. And in a way, I would say, therefore, it works as a document. It does capture where we are. And you look at the lacuna on that, particularly on that LGBT question. I just want to go back to what I said earlier. And I mean, of course, there were conversations at the table, which Jim was talking about. What I mean is it never managed to be a topic which was advanced in such a way that you could say, at the beginning of the assembly, the mind was this, and we've moved to this place. I can tell you on certain other issues, like the diaconate and women, there was significant movement, and a significant, if you like, movement of the spirit, I would say, in opening up new horizons. And that's what didn't happen with the LGBT question, because we're not ready to go there. We're not ready yet to have that conversation at a global level as a communion. We're just not there.
Yeah, at the same time, I think it's interesting that in the synthesis document in parts 15 and 16, there are some significant openings for kind of further theological reflection. And I think one of the interesting things is, if people look at those parts, 15 and 16, particularly towards the end, they'll see kind of invitations for further reflection on different anthropologies, and particularly, I think it's 15K or 16K, including people who are affected by these teachings, to kind of participate in the discussions. Can you talk a little bit about how you see those sections? And I guess the second part is what you would see the church doing, the lay faithful, theologians, whatnot, over the next 11 months, particularly about those, particularly about for LGBTQ people and those topics as they're brought up in the document.
Yeah, I think you're right. Those sections are significant, and where they talk particularly about the need for discernment, about so in other words, we can't simply take refuge in church teachings because we've inherited them from the past. They need to be interrogated or discerned in the light of developing understandings of anthropology and of science. Now, I think that was a very, very significant thing to put in, and it is an invitation, of course, to have the kinds of discussions which you guys, in a way, are having on outreach and in other places. And to say, we're not doing anything here that undermines church teaching by saying, is it not time to revisit some of these categories and these understandings? Cardinal Hollerich, the General Rapporteur of the Synod, has said exactly that. And church teaching constantly needs to be reinterrogated in the light of the signs of the times, if it is to be credible. And indeed, that is the test of its credibility, that it is able to perdure. As for the next year, we've just had the document land that spells out this process towards the next year, over the next year. And I think as far as the LGBT inclusion issue goes, I think there's a very clear invitation there to carry out listenings, and at a parish level to do exercises in participation, processes of participation, deliberately aimed at people who are on the margins of the church. Because I think the Synod Secretariat has said from the beginning, we need to get better at listening to the margins. In a way, the Synod process up to now, the struggle has been to get the Catholics in the pews together to do the Synod. But actually, as we move on, we've got to learn better to listen to the margins. So I would say there's an invitation there to do these things and not try and revisit the whole kind of Synod question, but to specifically to take the Synod synthesis document on that question, for example, of anthropology and science and what do we do, and do listening sessions and try and get more, I would say, to the heart of this question, with which I kind of began by saying there was a lack of clarity about what do you mean by exclusion and what do you mean by inclusion? Given that I would say is the mind of the Synod has been to say, yes, we need to be better at inclusion. What does that actually in practice mean? And just one anecdote, by the way, on this. I was very struck early on here in England and Wales when I spoke to a woman who had been in a same-sex relationship for I think they're married, civil partnership. No, I think it's marriage, but anyway, for many, many, many years. And she's a woman in her 50s. And she had become a Catholic in 2013, having heard Pope Francis. And she became a Catholic. She'd always wanted to became a Catholic, saw it was okay, Pope Francis there. But then as she put it to me, she always knew God loved her. She discovered that Pope Francis loved her, but she didn't think the church loved her until she took part in the Synod. And in fact, ended up helping to organize some Synod listenings. And her own self-understanding changed when she opened up to other people and they opened up to her and they shared their stories. And suddenly she realized that she was actually part of the church. She was a member of God's family. And this realization brought tears to her eyes and has transformed her own understanding. Now, this to me is the great gift of the spirit of the Synod. It is those transformations. Now, my question, I guess, to you guys would be, well, what helps to bring that about? How do we enable that process, that shift, that conversion? Or if you like, what prevents people from undergoing it? Would be, to me, a very interesting question.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of it is simple knowledge in the sense that a lot of people may not know what's going on in the church, may not know what's going on in the Synod, may have no clue that the Synod has talked about, on trying to understand a new anthropology. I often say to people, one of the most helpful things you can do for LGBTQ people is point out places where things are changing. For example, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, talking about transgender people, Pope Francis, all the many things, as you know, and you have documented that he has done. And so a lot of it is just kind of letting them know places where they're welcome. Ryan, did you want to jump in?
Yes, Austen, you've articulated this divide in the individual tables, Synod reports on LGBTQ topics between the West and then some non-Western countries, some of whom oppose even using the term LGBT, knowing the Pope as intimately as you do and having covered him for many years, how do you think he may navigate this tension? Is it the Pope's goal to form some kind of consensus, or is it his goal to expose, for lack of a better word, disagreements in the church?
Yeah, great question. I mean, first of all, I don't think it is as crude as West and non-West. I know I used those terms, but I think we have to nuance it because, of course, some of the strong reactions against the term LGBT came from, for example, countries in Eastern Europe. And Africa is a very big, complex place, as Jim knows better than I do from having been there. But yeah, roughly. So how is this? How is this divergence, to use the Synod word, how is it to be transcended? How is it to be overcome? What is the Pope looking for? I think what he wants is what's happening, to start with an acceptance of the reality and of the truth, and the truth of people's experience. And that's what we did have. And I think the October Assembly was successful in that experience was articulated. We encountered the sometimes shocking reality of what people believe and have experienced. And I think that shock probably was on both sides. I think Westerners were shocked to find out just how vehemently certain people felt from parts of the world. I think other people were very shocked at some of the stories they heard about discrimination and exclusion. So we're starting from the right place, which is experience and reality, because that's how you begin to discern. And I think then what the Pope wants is for us to hold those tensions together faithfully and prayerfully, to build communion while not trying to negotiate some agreement between us, but literally to hold them in tension, but to see ourselves as brothers and sisters in the process, which is the great gift of the conversation in the Spirit method, and then to allow over time, and he's a great believer in time, over time, prayerfully, trustfully, in humility, open ourselves to the new horizons that the Spirit is waiting to show us. So I think that's the Pope's, if you like, dream. Now, if consensus, and I use the word if advisedly, if consensus emerges from that process, then you can be pretty sure, Jim's the Jesuit and the expert, but you can be pretty sure, I think, as far as the Pope's concerned, that the Spirit's there. If after all of that, you could say, yes, we've come together around this, that would be, I think, for Francis, a very strong sign.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point, as usual, about the process and the relationship and the experience coming first. In his retreat talk at the very beginning, Timothy Radcliffe, former Master General of the Dominicans, quoted St. John Paul II, which really set the tone of the retreat for me, the Synod for me. Affective collegiality precedes effective collegiality, which I just felt that kind of unlocked everything. And in a sense, I think that this first session was all about affective collegiality, just getting to know people. One question that I've asked you privately, and nothing breaking confidence, is I'm really curious about, you talk about the groups that were shocked by stories and things like this. We work with LGBTQ Catholics, and one of the questions we're struggling with and dealing with is, for those people who might be closed off and consider it an ideology, consider it neocolonialism, and are, quite, vehement about that and sincere about it. They really do believe that this is something that is not native to their countries, foreign, in a way, sort of beyond the pale. When you think of certain delegates, and when you think of people that you've talked to who have that point of view, what do you think is the best way to kind of bring them into the discussion and, for example, help them see individual stories and maybe even help them see things a little differently?
Well, one of the most fruitful discussions that we had in the Assembly, and you've already raised it, was the one where we discussed the polarity of truth and mercy, or love and mercy, I think, as it was expressed. And I have a certain kind of affection for this issue because in the Continental Stage document, they quoted our document from England and Wales, which had exactly the quote of something like, how can the church better do what, if you like, Jesus does, which is to hold in perfect tension truth and mercy. So Jesus proclaims the truth, but is always merciful, always proclaims God's mercy, which is the truth and the mercy being the same thing, and so on. In practice, in the church, we are divided because we believe we attach more importance to one than the other. In practice, we find it very hard to hold these two in perfect tension. And I think what you have to do when you're talking to people who start from a deep sense of threat on this issue is you have to listen to the truth that they believe is under attack. Yeah. And that's why, for example, we know that Pope Francis feels very strongly against gender ideology. Gender ideology is felt, particularly in the developing world, as something which is imposed through international agencies. So there's this kind of almost anti-colonial feeling in resisting that. And you have to listen to them on that topic. And then, of course, obviously, when we're talking about homosexuality, we're not talking about gender ideology or the trans issue and so on. But they all get conflated. And I think first you have to listen and understand, just as you would, Jim, in listening to an LGBT person's story of exclusion, you would first invite them to just tell you what their experience is and how they see it. And then you can begin to start to understand where the sense of threat is. And I used to work I had a project called Catholic Voices, which is all about training Catholics to speak about issues of the church. And I would always say, use the Ignatian thing of where's the intention? Is this person, never judge a person's intention, find out what the intention is. Usually you will discover in listening to people tell you that, you will find yourself identifying with them. You'll say, yeah, they're right. There is something going on here that's not right. And then once you've established that connection and you have the empathy and the understanding, then you can begin then to introduce topics which then they may not have considered, which is, for example, how a person who is gay feels in the church, which proclaims certain things and which often acts in ways that leads to, you can begin to tell those stories and they then can be challenged by them. So I think that's what true dialogue, the dialogue that we're called to do now is. And I think what the Assembly did in October was it showed us that we're never, ever going to move together on this. We're never going to find what the Spirit is trying to say to the church until we're able to have those difficult, testing, challenging, and time-consuming conversations across boundaries.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think also, as you're talking, I'm realizing also doing it in person is really important. So being, a foot or two away from someone who has these ideas. As you know, what I try to do after some of these interventions is I try to seek out some of these people and talk with them. And they were very, they could be challenging conversations, but they were cordial conversations. And we, were able to be at the Eucharist the next day together and talk with one another and greet one another. Ryan, before we close out, do you have any other questions for Austen?
Sure, I'll end with this final question. Pope Francis will be 87 this Sunday. And very late in his pontificate, he has initiated this major synod and advanced dialogue around LGBTQ topics in the church. And I see him as a sort of Pope St. John the 23rd figure in the way that John the 23rd initiated Vatican II in 1962, but of course died before its conclusion. So it was finished by Paul VI. How does the Pope think about his own legacy and how this conversation around LGBTQ people might continue beyond his own life and into the pontificate of whoever is the next Pope?
I saw Pope Francis at the end of November. I was back in Rome, and he was suffering from bronchitis the day I saw him. And as you know, couldn't go to Dubai for COP28 as a result. But I just saw him, the other day give a fantastic interview to Mexican television. He's recovered. Yeah, he's taking longer to recover. He's 80. He's about to be 87. And as he said to Valentin Al-Azraqi, age, you can't hide it. It imposes limits. This is a pope who's having to slow down in so many respects, the trips and those. But here's the thing: I don't think there's anything basically wrong with him. He's an 87-year-old who gets chest conditions, but I think he's going to be fine. But I think more and more we're going to see a pope who's having to go to measure himself. But he has no illusions that he is, he's in that twilight zone. In fact, he spoke about the tomb being prepared for him at St. Mary Major. He's got this wonderful kind of attitude, really, which is, yeah, sure, I've got to get, choose my tomb, get it ready. Change the rites also for the papal funerals. He said to Valentin Al-Azraqi, he said, I'll be the first to road test them, We know we're in that phase. But here's the thing: however long Francis is with us, what the Synod has done, what this process has done, is construct or begin to construct a model for the church, a model of proceeding, a way of deliberating, of making decisions together in discernment, starting from the faith and the experience of the people of God. And this machine, this thing that we're constructing here, is neither democracy nor is it authoritarianism. It's something that belongs to the church from the early church, which is unique to the church, which is about opening ourselves up genuinely and authentically to the guidance of the Spirit. I think this is going to obviously outlast him, and he knows it will. This is for the next generation. This is for the future. And here's a thought maybe to kind of end with. The next conclave, whenever it happens, could be this year, could be next year, could be the following year, those cardinals will discuss for 2 weeks the state of the church. About a third of them will have been at the Synod Assembly, but almost all of them will have taken part in some way in the Synod. They'll know very well what's happened. And how can that not just shape the discussions that they have, but shape also the priorities of the man that emerges then onto the balcony following the next conclave? Yeah, this will be the first ever conclave in human history to take place against the backdrop of the greatest ever consultation of the people of God in the church's history. In a way, whatever happens now, Francis has done that. He's created that he's changed in that sense, opened that door for the church's future. And I find that very exciting. And it's been a real privilege to be a part of it.
And you're saying the greatest consultation ever in the church's history, referring to this synod even more than Vatican II?
Well, Vatican II, I mean, amazing as it was, didn't involve the ordinary people of God. Yeah, this is the first time we've had a process in which every single diocese of the world was invited to call together the parishes and the Catholic organizations and ask the ordinary people of God, so how about it? What's going on? What do you think of the church? What do you think of the way we do things? And that's never happened before. We've had consultations prior to synods, and before the Amazon Synod involved about 60,000 people in the Amazon. But this is the first time this has ever been done on a global scale. And people say, well, hardly anybody took part. Well, I think the best figures we have is somewhere around 6, 7, 8% of the practicing Catholic population. That's huge. US, 700,000. There's never been a consultation involving 700,000 people in the US. France, 200,000, Spain. These are big numbers. And the point is that we have this energy now, this dynamism from this participation. And that's my point, is that process, which we're still living through in its final phase, can but shape the future of the church, can but affect the conclave and the way that the next pope is elected, and indeed his priorities.
Well, Austen, thank you so much. It's always a joy to listen to you. You're so articulate, and you're such an articulate explicator of Pope Francis's thought and really of Catholic theology. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your participation. I know it was grueling for you too, because I saw you every day in the Synod. We're looking forward to what you have to contribute over the next 11 months and going ahead. And we also wish you and your family a Merry Christmas. This is Father Jim Martin for Outspoken, our conversations on outreach. I'm joined by Ryan Di Corpo, our managing editor. For more on the Synod, we have a whole section on outreach, looking at the Synod, looking at reactions to the Synod, and you can find a lot more on outreach.faith. And we will see you soon, and God bless you.